Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar series, which is on the topic of revitalizing exploration activity in Southern Africa. So, an extremely important topic. And this work really came from a scheduled conference that we were to have, which we were then unable to proceed with because of the coronavirus and the fact that we couldn't have large gatherings of people. And so we rather decided to put some of the papers and presentations into a webinar form. And at the moment, we obviously have today's webinar, and then we have another one on the 10th of June, which looks at various legal aspects associated with exploration, and then on the 17th of June, looking at financing issues. So I'd like to introduce you to Claude Baysac, who is our speaker today. And Claude is a recognized specialist in strategy, risk management and economic policy with over 20 years of executive and consulting work with corporates, governments and international organizations. He's a consumed multidisciplinarian with a wide combination of skills and experiences serving investment, operation and growth in emergent societies. Claude has worked as an economist for the African Development Bank, the World Bank and the United Nations. He served as Deputy Managing Director of Air Afrique, consulted with leading advisory firms like Deloitte, Kroll, K2 Intelligence, and a number of economic development firms. He secured, led or managed several hundred projects in addition to launching and running businesses. He has a distinct understanding of the strategic and operational realities of investing and managing businesses in emerging societies and of running and reforming these societies. He has a rare capacity to work effectively with senior government officials in both political and administrative functions, C-suite executives and boards, and members of civil society. For this reason, he's increasingly sought after as a corporate coach on corporate resilience, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. As a trained policy analyst and political scientist, he brings in-depth understanding of politics and the policy process. As an economist, he has a robust comprehension of the mechanism of growth and development, and he is a recognized expert on special economic zones and was president of the World Economic Zones Association between 2011 and 2014. He has a strong track record on the relationship between natural resources and sustainable growth, given the central role that these play in many emergent societies. For several years, he was involved in corporate integrity management, conducting investigations, crisis management, and corporate security projects throughout Africa. These complementary skills have led him to apply a solid political economy perspective on the respective roles of the state, business, and society towards sustainable growth. They also provide him with skills that are key to effectiveness, such as scenario analysis, strategic planning, policy and regulatory design, economic modeling and impact assessment, financial forecasting, and market research. He's worked across Africa, the Americas, Central Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. He's fluent in English and French, in the French Creoles of the Indian Ocean, and is conversant in Spanish. He's regularly consulted by leading international media on politics, policy, extractive industries, special economic zones, and related topics. He's spoken at numerous conferences, including the Free Zone Convention, the Joburg Indaba, the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Mine Africa, and the Mining Indaba. Claude has advanced degrees in economic geography from France and was a doctoral scholar in political science in the United States. So Claude is going to talk to us about impediments, potential and opportunities for increasing exploration activity in South Africa. Now, for those listening, what we'd like you to do is, if you have questions, you can you can put them up on the Q&A tab, and if you have comments, you can put them on the chat tab, and we'll deal with them in a session at the end. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Claude and welcome you, Claude, and thank you for giving this talk to us today.
Alastair, thank you very much. Can you hear me and can you see me okay?
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Yes,
okay.
To both of us.
Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to thank you for that very generous introduction. I couldn't have said it myself any better. But you know, my first job many years ago, the consulting firm I applied to, the managing partner looked at my CV and he said it's too good to be true, and therefore I didn't get the job. So maybe it is too good to be true. Anyway, what I'm going to do, thank you for having me, and I thank you, your organization. It's been a long time coming that we will be doing something together. So I'm very pleased and very grateful. I would also like to thank your attendants who have taken the time to join us in these difficult and interesting times. What I would like to propose, and Alastair, let me know if this is okay or if we need to change it a little bit, is I will do a fairly brief PowerPoint presentation based on some data that I have, and which provides, if you want, the background for an active conversation that I would like to have about conditions for successful exploration in South Africa. We have done a lot of work on the relationship, and you will see some of that. Alastair?
We seem to be having a bit of feedback or something. Camilla, can you help us there?
Yeah, I would have liked to be, you know, what I can try to do is I can put my ugly headphones on, which perhaps will help with the feedback, if that's okay, but I would have to go fetch them.
It seems to be better now that you've spoken again. Perhaps maybe try turn off your video and then just try and present without your video. Maybe that will just...
Okay, so what you mean by that, but can I still share my screen?
Yes, you can still share your presentation, just turn off your video. Yep.
Okay, so perfect, I'll do that. Okay, so I've turned off my video, is that any better?
Sounds better, Claude.
Okay, great. So now let me go ahead and share my screen. Here we are. I'm still getting used to this. Okay. I think we are here. Can you see it?
Yes, we see your presentation.
Lovely. And the sound quality is okay?
It seems better. I will let you know if you have any more challenges in between.
Okay. So thank you for that. And so let me go with that. So today's presentation topics is impediment potential and opportunities for increasing exploration in Southern Africa and South Africa. What I'd like to do is a little blurb about economics, but you've heard a lot about this. Just to reiterate, we work at the nexus of risk management strategy and economic growth. And our focus is fragile states and resource-rich countries. And we bring together political science, economics, risk management in an integrated concept of resilient societies, resilient businesses in resilient societies, resilient economic sectors that provide sustainable opportunities for growth. And we work indeed with corporates and governments and international organizations. So let me start with a bit of the data. And what I did playing with the data.
Hi, Claude. Sorry to interrupt you. I think we're still having that bit of feedback from your end. So it might be advisable for you to just get the other, you know, the additional technical support that you were talking about.
Give me a minute and I will go get my headphones and hopefully that will improve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yes, Claude.
Yeah, how is that?
That sounds a lot better.
Okay, good. So perfect. Thank you very much for your patience, everybody, and my apology for that. Okay, so to get back, this is what I decided to do. We've done a lot of work trying to understand the relationship between economic growth, the mineral sector, and commodity price. So in 2012, and then we updated it last year, we did a fairly big piece of work where we looked at 48 sub-Saharan African countries, and we correlated so mineral growth for these 48 countries over a period of 40 years, and then we correlated economic growth with mineral rents, and then these two with commodity prices. And we did it for oil-rich countries, and we did it for mineral-rich countries. And what we discovered was very interesting, and it is going to be the foundation of this presentation. We discovered that there is usually a great disparity between the rent and growth behavior of mineral economies versus the rent and growth behavior of oil economies. And to simplify that, what we have effectively is we have almost a perfect correlation between commodity prices and oil prices, oil rent in the countries that have oil, and GDP growth. And we can see that now, it's intuitive. As soon as oil prices increase or decrease, the oil rents increase or decrease very rapidly in concert, and GDP growth decreases or increases in concert. So, and in essence, what it tells us is that countries that produce oil tend to have their economies, particularly if these economies have just discovered oil and they are not very sophisticated advanced economies, oil resources tend to swamp these economies. And so when times are good, we have this enormous influx of investment and enormous influx of revenues, and all that comes with it, the Dutch disease and so on. And we have massive amount of enrichment. But it also, the Dutch disease is the counterpart of that, is that it tends to destroy the rest of the economies. So when there is a bust, then we see that the entire economies goes down and government revenues collapse and they have to borrow and so on and so forth. That's the oil-rich countries. Mineral-rich countries are quite different in the sense that there isn't a powerful correlation between commodity prices, mineral prices, GDP growth, and mineral rents. And in some countries, like in South Africa, in some cases, there is an inverse relationship between those variables, which means that you can have very high priced mineral commodities, and you can have either high rent or low rent in a particular mining country, and you could have high growth or negative growth in this particular country. And this is really interesting, and it got us to think a lot about what could be causing the difference between the behavior of oil and the behavior of minerals. And an hypothesis is obviously that these are very different geologies and they require very different investment. And because of that, they require a very different policy environment. So what we discovered is that oil economies and oil sectors are resilient to policy, good and bad, but are not at all resilient to changes in oil prices. And we have the converse in mineral economies, where mineral countries and mining sectors can be resilient to commodity prices to some extent, not obviously absolutely resilient, where you could have lower commodity prices, low mineral prices, and yet the sector in the country is resilient and holds its share of GDP. And also you can have resilient economies irrespective of what's happening in the mining sector. And the key difference really between that, so the key variable that we discovered impacts the sustainability and the resilience and the performance of the mining sector versus the oil sector is policy. So in the oil economy, policy is almost, I would say, irrelevant. Not entirely irrelevant, and you could obviously have very bad policy and kill your oil sector. But we can see countries that are at war, like Iraq, for instance, and to some extent are still able to produce some oil if those oil fields are not being attacked directly. But you can have countries that are terribly managed, that have very high levels of poverty, that have very bad policies, that have very corrupt policies, that are very inefficient social systems, and they can have massive amount of oil production, irrespective of the policy, with high level of royalties, etc. The converse is not true for the mining sector. The mining sector is highly dependent on policy and the quality and the nature and the consistency of policy. So what we're looking at now, and this is kind of my introduction. So what we're looking here is a bit of analysis that I've done to show you how that seems to work in Southern Africa. We are looking here at the top 10 exploration budgets between 2000 and 2018. I'm sorry, I didn't source it, but this is Thomson Reuters data, and I will have to source it when I send it to you guys, in USD million. And so what you have is you have the top 10 countries, the top chart, and obviously from left to right, South Africa having been for a long time the dominant country in terms of exploration budget. But we can also see that it has been trailed very closely by the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then we have these extraordinary newcomers like Ghana and Burkina Faso and Tanzania. And then we have more established jurisdictions like Zambia, which hasn't done very good in terms of exploration budgets. And then we have the rest of the pack, which we see countries like Mali have been seeing overall increases in exploration budgets, and Cote d'Ivoire. What's quite remarkable here is the decline in South Africa's exploration budget in relation to its history. And if we look at the chart below, what we see is that for the entire period, obviously 2000 and 2018, South Africa had a total exploration budget receipt of $3.5 billion. And then followed by the DRC. But the DRC share mainly comes from the period 2010-2018, and which is about 3 times what it experienced in 2000-2008. And this is true for all the other jurisdictions that we have in our top 10. So all of them have seen significant increases and sometimes quite spectacular increases in their exploration expenditures by companies. If you look at Burkina Faso, for instance, even Zambia has done quite well. And South Africa, conversely, is the only country in our sample which shows a decrease in the exploration spent between 2000 and 2008 on the one hand, and 2010, 2018 on the other hand. And this is a very important fact, and we will talk a bit about that. Now, if we look at the second aspect of our presentation, and I'm trying to press down, and there we go, is mineral rents. So here, what we're looking at is effectively the economic contribution minus spent, and that's important to say it because spent is a big part of the economic contribution, but it's the net contribution of mining in those top 10 countries as a share of GDP. And what we can see here is a very important difference between South Africa and the other jurisdictions is that South Africa's share has never been greater than 15% over the past 18 years or so. Whereas in the DRC, it peaks at 35%. In Zambia, it peaks at 20%. In Burkina Faso, it's gone from about 5% to 20%. We can see Zambia going up and down, and we can see the increase of mineral rents in Mali and the progression in Namibia, and obviously the impact of the cycles, commodity cycles in all of these countries. Now, but what does it tell us? What it tells us is that South Africa is a relatively highly diversified economy versus the others. Certainly more diversified than Namibia and Botswana and Cote d'Ivoire, but their rents are fairly low because these are, to the exception of Namibia and Botswana, but I put Tanzania in that, countries that are experiencing growth in the mining economy, countries that were, except for diamonds in Namibia and Botswana, just not on the map of mining just a few years ago. Now, there again, what we see in terms of the distribution of the rents over the period 2018 is that, South Africa has been relatively flat. And South Africa didn't do particularly well in terms of attracting mining investment, in terms of generating mining value added during the infamous commodity boom. And there's been a lot of conversation about the fact that South Africa missed that, that super cycle. And if you look at the DRC, for instance, you can see, and Ghana is the case, and Burkina Faso, Tanzania, just about all these countries are actually performing better now in terms of rent generation than they were during the boom period, which is quite extraordinary and perhaps a bit counterintuitive. So, and that's particularly, again, marked for a country like Burkina Faso, and by a newcomer like Mali. And obviously the DRC has done quite well. So we have quite a differentiated landscape, but I'll come back to that. The third dimension that we're looking at is the Fraser Institute's score in terms of attractiveness and perceptions over these jurisdictions. And I just want to say here that what I did is they have three sub-scores: policy quality, policy perception, investment attractiveness, and a third one, which I just kind of forgot, but will come back to me. What I did is I added these three in terms of their scores, and then I averaged it. And so we have here a compared average view of, composite view of the Fraser Institute's three measures. And what we can see, and the lower the score, the better. And what we can see is that over the past 8 years or so, they only started doing this survey in 2011. We see a fairly unequal field, and where South Africa and the DRC, despite their enormous size in relative to other countries, are not the most attractive jurisdictions and don't have, from a perceptive standpoint, the best reputation. The DRC, we shouldn't be surprised, have been massive amount of policy instability and uncertainty. They improved quite nicely at the beginning of the 2010s decades, and then suddenly they published that radical mining code, which really damaged the perception. South Africa has remained unequally mediocre, if I dare say so. Tanzania, which started quite well, has now, scored the second worst in the top 10 countries, or the third worst if I add Cote d'Ivoire, because of all of the policy uncertainties and the rash decisions made by the government. On the other hand, we see, Mali has done some improvement, but overall, it's not a particularly attractive situation. I mean, the best country is still Botswana, which ranks amongst the best in the world. And Ghana is not bad. And then, as I said again, South Africa, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Tanzania, amongst the worst, not just in Africa, but in the world. Now, if we overlay these things to try to understand some of those correlations and relationships, there are a few interesting things. So if we look at the correlation that's at South Africa and the DRC, correlations between, on the one hand, exploration budgets and mineral rents, and on the other hand, exploration budgets and perceptions in the Fraser ranking, we see firstly that there is quite a powerful correlation between mineral rents and exploration, both in the DRC and in South Africa, for the period 2000-2017. And that's quite interesting. This is the first time I've looked at this, the exploration mineral rent stuff. I've looked at prices and GDP growth and mineral rents, but never exploration. And I thought I would use the opportunity of this conference to do that. And so I'm kind of discovering with you guys, and we'll have to kind of start thinking about what it may mean, although I have some hypotheses in my head. But we see there is no correlation between the Fraser Institute and exploration, and there's obviously no correlation between the Fraser Institute's rankings and mineral rents. And that's quite important for me, a discovery, because we have said a lot and we hear a lot said about the importance of the Fraser Institute in terms of guiding investment and guiding the behavior of mining companies. So I tried a number of lags, and 1 year lag, 2 year lag, and I saw some correlations appearing. So for instance, we have some correlation in Tanzania. We have some correlations in Zambia, not meaningless, not particularly strong, but not meaningless, but they are inverse correlations. And then the only country where I saw a positive correlation between these different variables, i.e. exploration FR and rents FR, is Ghana. So I need to do a bit more work about that, but I'm going to kind of now make my way through the topic. But I thought it's important for us to first have a look at data that is out there, that exists, and that guide us in trying to understand what's going on, and influence where we can our own strategies if we are in mining, but also influence policies if we are in government, and if we are in mining trying to influence policy, well, really speaks from the facts rather than just perception and the narrow perspective of our own mining companies. So let me step back a little bit now and speak a little bit about the work that we did 2 years ago at the request of Sibanye-Stillwater. It's published, it's on our website, unomics.com/our work. And it's a study that Sibanye-Stillwater asked us to do to try to understand the relationship, the correlation between, on the basis of all the work we've done in the past, between public policy in South Africa, and specifically the mining charter and the MPRDA, and the performance of the mining sector. And by the performance of the mining sector, we defined that as looking at a number of variables for which there was sufficient amount of data. And that included, obviously, rents. It also included production, employment, exports, and value added in the sectors. And we did comparative studies between the performance of South Africa and also share prices. And we compared South Africa's performance against a number of peer jurisdictions. Obviously taking commodity prices as the kind of independent variable. And we looked at Australia, we looked at Zambia, we looked at the DRC, we looked at, I believe, Canada. But again, it's available on our website. And what we observed is that South Africa's economic performance in terms of the mining indicators of performance was far worse than its peer countries on a normative basis. And again, and this performance very strongly correlated with policy changes. And what was very interesting, and this is important, is initially, so there was tremendous market reaction and there was but there was a lag in production reaction, obviously, and there was the lag in employment reaction and a lag in export reaction, but you can still see them when the first mining charter draft got leaked. Massive shock. And then another shock when the MPRDA was published and enforced, and then progressively lower shocks when you had the release of Mining Charter 2 and the release of Mining Charter 3 and the MPRDA Amendment Bill and then the MPRDA Amendment Act. But what was very interesting is so you have a dulling effect of these policy choices over time, but in a mining sector in South Africa, which is in decline. And tells us effectively the story of that graph you're looking at now, which is, you know, the decrease of the rents as a share of GDP, starting, you know, in 2008. And comparing that with a number of other countries, it was very clear. So it's very clear that policy has had a very detrimental impact on the mining sector. And now when we look at exploration budgets in South Africa, and I go back to this chart with apologies, we see that South Africa has behaved relatively worse than its peers, not just in absolute amounts of dollars invested, but also in terms of the investment it has received in the period 2008 versus 2010, 2018. So what we have is we clearly have a situation in South Africa where policy, government policy, and I want to be very specific about that, has played a dampening role, a negative role in the performance of the mining sector and obviously the performance of exploration sector. Now, this is fundamentally the problem we face. We can obviously add the energy crisis, but the energy crisis is a policy-generated crisis, so I put it in policy, not as some sort of external economic shock that suddenly hit us, you know, strangely. You know, we've had it now for about 10 years, and we've done very little, if anything, about fixing that. So we have a general policy problem, which is dampening the mining sector. We also know that it's not just a mining sector specific problem because it's impacting a lot of the productive sectors. So how do I view mining in South Africa in that particular context? Well, for me, mining has really been the canary in the mine, not to do an easy pun, in the sense that, and we see that in many other countries that have mining sectors. Mining is a rent-seeking sector. It requires massive amount of capital, and it requires tremendous amount of policy certainty and policy stability because of the long investment leads and because of the need to continuously reinvest in order to replace depleting resources. And there is a tremendous mismatch between the investment cycle of the capital markets, which look for short-term returns, the investment cycle of the mining houses, which look for 10, 15, 20, 30-year return, and the political policy cycles of government, which will usually run around 5-year cycle. And I think what we have is we have this collision of these different cycles in South Africa and Southern Africa, which prevent mining from playing the role it has to play. Why? Because mining is an easy target for nationalist, nativist policies. It's a very emotive sector because it has to do with colonization and apartheid. It is a living symbol of past exploitation. and inequalities. And it is also a tangible thing, that gold which we have in our soil, that diamonds which we have in our soil. And therefore, it is the prime target with land for emotive populist policies, which we can use to all sorts of effects, economic effects, political effects, and so on and so forth. And so the sad reality is that South Africa has very much in the past 10 years fallen victim to what we call the resource curse. And the sector has been increasingly, not just politicized, because it always was politicized, it was increasingly targeted as a target of opportunity for populist nationalistic policies, which pretend to advance the cause of economic growth and employment and eradication and equality, but in fact do the contrary. So what is to be done? So firstly, we need to understand, and this is a very sobering point, that without exploration, this country is going to hit in the next 10, 15, 20 years an absolute wall of, or I would say a cliff rather than a wall, a chasm, a Grand Canyon of disappearing resources. If we are not exploring, and we are not sufficiently exploring, and the data shows it, how are we possibly going to be replacing our depleting resources in the next 10 to 20 years? This is a catastrophe that is looming over our horizon. And a lot of the mining houses have stopped exploring or have reduced exploration in South Africa for the very reasons I've discussed, and looking elsewhere to diversify, to acquire other resources. And if we look at the big transactions, the big acquisitions, the big mergers, or the big separations and delisting and relisting, they are not about new resources. They are about old existing assets and mines that are being grabbed and integrated into existing companies purely for economies of scale and nationalizations, but they're being farmed. So it is absolutely vital that we get exploration going. And I take note of the government's intention to restart the process of exploration, and particularly having put some resources into having a new database of geological resources. But that's not enough. This is just the beginning. And I don't hear enough of the government's understanding the extent to which it is the overall investment climate, obviously, and specifically the mineral legislation and the continuous uncertainty over the mining charter that prevent investment in exploration. And I want to say here, it's very important to separate in the conversation about policy the aspect of policy certainty and uncertainty versus the aspect of policy quality, lack of quality. And I think that particular aspect has been lost in the conversation in South Africa for as long as I've been here, which is that, if we ask policy certainty to our government, we may get policy certainty, but it's not the kind of certainty we want. So we will be certain that we cannot invest. We'll be certain that we cannot, export our returns, that we have to beneficiate locally, and so on. How much more time do I have? Just seeing.
About 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll finish soon, and then we can discuss. But so I always say as a joke, you had great policy certainty in the Soviet Union, and the certainty that you would not invest in that place. So we don't need just policy certainty, we need policy quality. So the role of policy is to find the balance between between the contested interests that mire the mining sector, the interest of the investors, the interest of the mining companies, of the employees, of the communities, of government, of the citizens. And that requires a tremendous amount of equilibrium and balancing and thinking and prudence. And changing these rules every 2 or 3 or 5 years, or saying, well, this mining charter is only for 5 years, we'll change it again in 5 years' time, is really, you can't say, we've created policies only for 5 years, come invest. Oh, and by the way, in 5 years' time, we will create a bit of, we'll change things. Well, that is policy uncertainty for now, because you're investing for 15, 20 years. So this is, I think, where we are. We really need to revisit the relationship between the performance of the mining sector and that of exploration sector. We need to understand the mistakes we've committed. And unfortunately, I don't see enough of that conversation. And I am here throwing the stone at everybody, the mining sector, the Minerals Council, the governments, the labor unions, and all the policy and political entrepreneurs who are out there trying to make a quick political buck on the back of this debate. But I think it's time, to have conversations about the mineral economy in South Africa on the basis of solid data, solid economic theory, comparative analysis, and best practice, for a simple purpose, right? Is if you don't use it, that stuff disappears. Sterilizing a resource and saying, well, we're not going to touch it for the next 20 years because we screwed it up, but the next generation will benefit from it. That doesn't work. Look at Guinea. They've been squabbling and arguing for 50, 60, 100 years about their extraordinary resources, and nobody's benefited from it. And who knows, one day maybe iron will no longer be useful. It will be replaced by something else, or coal resources. It's great to have all these coal resources in our soil. We're very happy about it. We don't want to touch it because we don't want that dirty capitalists or dirty state-owned companies touch it. But in the meantime, it's out there. It's in there. And then, before you know it, coal is persona non grata in the global economy. What we have in this soil, we must know what is there, and we must decide how to economically exploit it. We cannot do that without exploration. We cannot do that without venture capital. We cannot do that without the type of firms that raise money at risk and come in South Africa. We have told these people they're not welcome here. Therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that on the back of a declining mining industry, we have this gigantic hole in our resource base, and we're going to have this enormous cliff in 10, 15, 20 years. And then we will be where? We will be there. 2-3% of the economy will be generated by mining, but it will not have been the product of tremendous amount of investment and progress in other sectors, like agriculture, or manufacturing, or the service sector. It will have been the product of a devastated economic environment, which will land us to being not a South Africa, but a DRC, a Zambia, countries that have nothing left but this. And therefore, they may then see a rebirth of the mining sector and something like that. But it won't be the product of growth, it will be the product of recession. We must absolutely avoid that. And I close my case.
Well, thanks very much, Claude, for that really interesting presentation there, and those views on policy and so on. Let's just have a look here on the question and answer. I've got a question that's come in from Mark Austin. And the question is, does the exploration budget quoted in this presentation include brownfields exploration, or is it just greenfields exploration?
I believe it's both, but I would have to check the data and come back to you. I also have last year's data, but I decided not to include it because I only had mineral rent data to 2017, but the data is out as of 2019.
Okay, thanks. That seems to be the only question there at the moment. Just a point from my side.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think people, quite often sort of say is that, oh, but this country is explored anyway, and there isn't anything else to find. And what has been found is pretty much being depleted. So I wanted to figure out if that was a myth or not. And so we did some work, and that was through the Mandela Mining Precinct, to actually ascertain how much is out there and how much is left. And we commissioned some people to have a look at putting that study together. And really, it doesn't matter what commodity you're looking at. We have a great deal of resource still to be proven up, resource in the ground. And and I think when you sort of look at something like coal, I remember in probably 20 years ago, there was a concern that coal was going to be depleted by 2020. Well, that's not the case, and albeit that some of the coal that we're having to work with now is poorer quality, but nevertheless, there are still very substantial coal deposits left. And I listened to a very interesting presentation by the Fossil Fuel Foundation the other day, looking at clean coal and the way in which you can, in fact, capture every one of those dirty products and turn them into something useful, which is pretty important for South Africa and its future. So I think that myth of us not having resources is just that. So we need to find the ways to get at it. So, you've pointed towards policy, but is it not also, and that's why we're having a session on legal aspects as to whether there are legal impediments to get into exploration rights, barriers to entry for junior exploration companies, financing issues through flow-through share schemes or whatever, the thrust for beneficiation, does that put people off? Saying, well, why should I go into exploration? I don't want to be forced into beneficiation. I want to export this product. And then input costs on things like electricity and diesel and so on and so forth. So, it's sort of question: is it a policy issue or is it all of the above?
Well, Alastair, firstly, I'll go to your first point about the resource. I think the country, it is known that the country still has massive amount of resources to be proved and discovered and proven and developed. I'm having a number of conversations about rare earths. This is a typical example of highly sought after, highly contested, geopolitically relevant resources, of which South Africa has a fair amount, but hasn't been able to play the type of role that it could play because of the policy environment. And that leads me to qualify what I mean by policy. So policy is obviously the general policy investment climate environment, and not just the tangible comparable elements of policy, but also, if you want, the atmosphere, the zeitgeist, the pro-private sector, anti-private sector, statism, etc., populist or less so. So that's, for me, that's policy, the politics of policy, if you want. And how the economic pie gets divided by whom. And as part of that, obviously, is regulation and administration and the quality of the public sector, the response of the public sector. I put clearly infrastructure as a product of policy because what we see in terms of the input cost in relation to our transport cost and our electricity cost and our water availability and water cost is essentially the matter of policy failures. I mean, yes, we are a water scarce country, and yes, our electricity is generated mainly by dirty coals. But we also have an appallingly badly managed water infrastructure and underinvestment, and we are not water efficient. And we certainly are not water fair in terms of the access and distribution and cost of water. So I see this clearly as being a block. The competitive environment, the kind of very concentrated nature of the mining industry in South Africa is obviously nothing new. We've seen tremendous amount of changes, but I think, yes, we need to see a better competitiveness setup. We need to see stronger antitrust and trust busting policies to create the breathing space for junior miners and exploration companies. But again, that is to some extent a policy discussion, a policy conversation that needs to take place. And it can't be left just to the mining industry and the existing players, because they have vested interest in keeping things as they are, funnily enough. And the question of access to finance, I don't see access to finance as being a particular problem in South Africa. I mean, geez, if you have countries like the DRC and Zambia and Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea and Papua New Guinea able to attract massive amount of investment from junior miners, they don't have capital markets. The money comes from elsewhere. South Africa has tremendous still assets in terms of capital markets. The skills and resources, the competences are there. I really think for me, it really is that kind of investment climate policy environment issue. Are you going to read the question, or can I? The next one?
Yeah, there are two questions from
yes.
Rant. Let's take them one at a time. So
Sure.
the first one is there a correlation between a country's corruption index and its greenfields exploration spend or investment?
That's a great question. Look, I have the data on both. So just to do a bit of advertising, we've built this thing which we've called Unomics GCR, Geopolitical and Country Risk. It's a huge database of security, political and governance, regulation, economic infrastructure growth per sector, and I mean, how many indicators you want, we have them. Social performance, environmental performance, and we've all normed all that, and we can correlate all these indicators for all the countries of the world, or we can, do the top 20s in the world, or the BRICS countries, etc. over the past 20 years. Hey, Tibeti, nice to see you. So we have the data. I haven't looked at that. I can look at it quickly and see if there's a correlation. My sense is that it's unlikely that there is a correlation between the two. I don't think corruption. I don't think corruption in the short term drives businesses away. I think corruption certainly correlates overall with levels of economic activity, but I think it's a complex relationship. I mean, I have lots of clients who operate in very corrupt countries, and they seem to be doing so very effectively. No more said.
Okay, great, thanks. And the second question from David there is, what changes would you like to see in the South African policy to create growth in the exploration industry?
Right, so I think we need to clearly separate the exploration sector, the junior sector, from the established mining sector. And I think it would be greatly progressive to have a junior and exploration mining policy framework, which would do away with the highest policy costs. So including, I think, significantly reducing, for instance, BE requirements, significantly reducing tax levels, providing tax incentives for those, making it very easy licensing, reducing the licensing requirements, reducing the licensing cycle, while maintaining all of the community, and that is very important for me, all the communities and all of the environmental requirements. But I think we need to really carefully separate the mining sector from the exploration and development sectors in terms of the legislation. And I would suggest maybe that the government actually creates a special set of licensing specialists and experts in the DMR who would be solely tasked with supporting junior and exploration companies. And the reason why I say we would need to separate those is not because I'm particularly fond of the overall mining legislation, or at least its execution, but because the mining sector itself is very contentious in South Africa, politically, economically, socially, etc. And that conversation is taking place and the battles are still being fought. But if we could at least agree that we are facing this potential collapse in our mining sector on the basis of lack of exploration and development, then we can all agree, to continue fighting on the mining side, but work together progressively towards defining a kind of special economic zone type regime for exploration and development.
Okay, thanks very much, Claude. And I've got one other question from Dr. Tubedi Ramoncha. He says, thank you for the presentation. How do you define rent?
Okay, so Tibedi, good to have you here. It's been a while. I hope you're well. This definition is quite simple. It is the turnover minus the production cost. So it's the net surplus of the mining. So you remove from the rent things like the equipment purchase and all of the expenditures of mining, including salaries. So the spent is, so it's revenues minus spent. So it's typically not your gross product, which is then allocated to the different parties. So it does not, but includes tax, all right? So in there you have tax. So for instance, very interesting, if you look at a country like Zambia, in the late 1990s, while they were producing about 200,000 tons of copper, they had negative resource rents. It doesn't mean that nothing was spent in the country. It means that after paying salaries and input costs, the result was negative to the country. So then they should have left that stuff in the ground. It was more valuable unexploited than not. So the important conversation about rents is that it does leave out the very important element of economic contribution, which is all the spent. And unfortunately, there is no worldwide, Africa-wide data on the spent. And that's unfortunate, but we have to understand that if you don't have, whether it's public-owned mining companies or whether it's privately owned mining companies, if you don't have mineral rents, you don't have a surplus, you don't have a case. The reason why is because that is where the investment gets repaid. It gets repaid from the rent. So we can see that in countries where there is very low rents or there's negative rents, you don't have investments. And even if you're the government, you need to be able to continue investing. And what we see in Zambia, and that was a big debate about state ownership, is, well, if we have state ownership, we don't need rents because government owns, it doesn't need to create a profit. All it needs to do is pay for the expenditures, generate some social product out of that, and then funds for any exploration and any development and in renewal of the tons of the ounces out of the general budget. That doesn't happen. Governments never do that, except in some rare cases like in Chile, but there they've generated massive amount of rents. So even if you have state-owned mining, you need to generate rents, which means that you have to produce very efficiently. And as we can see in a lot of our state-owned enterprises in South Africa, that is not happening. So that's why I'm dead set against public ownership of mining companies, not because I'm a dirty capitalist wanting to see some of my London and Paris peers get rich, but because it destroys economies.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I think we are out of time. And thanks everybody for coming online and your questions and your interest. As I said, we do have other dates where we've got other speakers coming in, and I will be encouraging other people to still come on board, that we won't sort of close the thing off. And that as we do, then we'll be collecting comments and so on and getting them into the journal, so that there's a sort of real takeaway from these events. So with that, I don't think there's any other questions. There's a comment there. Thank you for a very interesting presentation from David.
Thank you.
And I think, yeah, I think that's it. So once again, thank you very much, Claude.
Well, it's a pleasure. And I perhaps as a parting shot, thank you for having me. Thank my appreciation to all the participants and the questions. And also perhaps, Alastair, perhaps there's opportunity to write something with the Institute about this, to put all this data and these perceptions or perspective that I've shared with you on some sort of an article or an analysis or something, and I would be happy to do that. Well, if it helps.
No, absolutely. We encourage people to do that. So you can write a paper for the journal. It goes into the journal.
Okay.
You can have it either just as a unrefereed paper or as a refereed paper, and
yes,
national recognition, or just pure comments on the website.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so with that then, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day, and cheerio.